I want to welcome you to The Optimistic American. We're here today to talk about hope. Now today, as part of our series of Finding Agency, we're going to talk about how it is that you can master your emotions, how cognitive distortions can have a negative impact on your thinking, and different things that you can do for yourself to try to help move you into a better state. I'm here with Dr. Emily Bashah, a psychologist who has spent a lot of time on this clinically. I think you're going to find this very helpful because all of us have cognitive distortions. Each of us are affected by our actions, and our actions come from our thoughts and our feelings and our physiology. We're going to talk not only about that connection and how they all interrelate, but we're also going to talk about, again, what it is that you can do to help find your sense of agency. Welcome. Dr. Bashah, welcome to The Optimistic American.
Thank you, Paul, for having me.
Oh, no, thanks for being a part of this program on an ongoing basis. All right, so today what we want to talk about is this whole idea of mastering your emotions. Now, I know we're going to go into this concept of cognitive distortions, and we're going to go into CBT therapy, not only a therapy that you might get from a psychologist, but how you might self-administer some of those portions. But before we do, let's spend a little bit of time talking about this whole concept of what is an emotion? How does that differ from a feeling? How does a feeling differ from a thought, right? Because I think all of those come into play in this. And here's one of the things that I find to be interesting is that there are all these invisible forces, these things that you can't see that have huge impacts on your life, right? Even the ideals that we talk about, ideals are really something that you could think are made up or that are imaginary or that are not real. I like what Plato told us. Plato told us that actually oftentimes the ideal that we have is more real than what it is that we see. So he used the example of a triangle, that if you have a triangle, we have all these properties that would make a perfect triangle. But if you were to draw the triangle, you can't draw it perfectly. It's not perfect. And consequently, you end up creating what is more the image of perfection. Well, the perfection in his mind was more real than what it was that we could imagine, or what it is that we could actually draw. I think that's true with a lot of the things we're talking about here today, especially when it comes to the ideals that are important to being able to change your life. All right, so let's start with this thought. Again, the whole concept of feelings, emotions, and thoughts. How would you differ those?
So emotions and feelings are the same thing. That might be if you're happy, if you're sad, if you're anxious. A thought, people oftentimes will say, well, I feel paranoid. Well, paranoia is actually a thought. That you think somebody's out to get you, you think someone's trying to hurt you or harm you, but that could make you feel anxious. It can make you feel nervous. So oftentimes in therapy, part of my work is really to help people differentiate what is the difference between a feeling and emotion, which is the same thing, versus a thought. So we'll go through lots of different examples and I'll have them identify different things. So that's really important. Now, those also are interconnected to actions. What one does is influenced by how they feel and what they think. And it's also interconnected with physiology. And those are all interconnected with one another. Mm-hmm. So at any point, it's sometimes really hard to pinpoint exactly where the evolution of something might start from. Cognitive theorists would say it's the cognition. Behavioral theorists would always go to, well, you have to change the behavior if you want to change anything. Mm-hmm. So
both
it depends.
might be right.
Yeah, and then cognitive behavioral theorists would then say, well, they're all interconnected. Mm-hmm. So I tell people really start with what is easiest to identify. For people who tend to gravitate and be more emotional, finding the emotion might be easier for them. So then we'll start there in identifying it, targeting it, and then finding the links between the behaviors and the actions and the thoughts that are connected in the physiology and the body sensations, what's going on inside of them. So they might feel an accelerated heart rate. The emotion might be anxiety. The thought might be, oh my gosh, this person I really liked ghosted me. And then that might then lead into a whole nother segment. Body sensations might be like lethargy. And then that takes you down another rabbit hole. And so sometimes it can be hard to just pause that process and really dissect it. There's a lot of really great worksheets online. I think it'd be helpful for us to do a tip sheet on this, just so people can see what this looks like.
We will put a tip sheet online for this.
Yeah, it's helpful to work through the worksheets, especially when you have what we call a hot thought. And those are ones that you tend to come back to. And you know that they're there and they're driving particular emotions. So for people who tend to be more analytic and self-analytic, it'll be easier for them to oftentimes catch the thought rather than the emotion. People who tend to numb their emotions or detached from their emotions, it's sometimes harder. It's like pulling teeth in therapy. It's like, well, imagine that somebody else thinking this, how might they feel? And so sometimes they really have to extract the emotions from outside of them rather than really finding it inside. So I'll really work with where people are at, and everybody will have something to work with.
All right. So I want to do a little sum up, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. And I want to start with the simple before we get to the more complex. But just as you were saying a moment ago, I find this to be fascinating. People tend to believe that they are what they believe, not recognizing that really the way the rest of the world sees them is by their actions. Right, by how it is that they act. So, as an example, if I'm a deeply religious person and I read scripture or the Torah or for that matter the Quran, whatever it is, right, and I believe that I'm a deeply religious person and that I've based my values on things that are good, and that's who I am. But yet, when I come home, somebody's parked too close to my driveway, and I yell and scream at them, get mad, go in the house, and I'm angry because of all the things that have happened. People don't see you as a religious person. They see you as an angry person. Our actions determine who we are. It's not our beliefs. Our beliefs are important, and they're important in that they have an effect on actions. But actions directly relate to our life. And knowing that, I think that you have to kind of start on the very back end. I believe one of the first things that you should do is think about what is the meaning of life. What does it matter to you? What are the things that you can do that can put meaning into it? And again, we've talked about Viktor Frankl quite a bit, which is, that meaning is found in who and what we love. It's found in what we create, our art, our music, our business, and it's also found in who we serve and struggle. Those are the things that affect meaning. But starting from the back end is important, so at least you know, where do I want to get to? But oftentimes it's hard to figure out, well, how do I begin to change my action so I do it? Having a plan by itself isn't enough, because your emotional state and your thoughts actually affect how you act. And that's where it becomes more complex. So let's go to a simple example. You have a young girl who is constantly lethargic, tired. She's in a state where she feels depressed, where she doesn't want to do anything during a day, right? And then you start to figure out, she eats a bowl of cornflakes for breakfast. She has no real lunch, and then she picks at something for dinner. Well, there actually is a physiological effect that you can have on somebody by not eating enough. Changing your diet can have an effect. So you have to include physiology into the equation. You can't leave it out. It has such a huge component in determining who we are. And the physiological parts of our body are thinking about diet and exercise. Both of those come into play.
Yeah. So There's quite a few things I want to touch on. So let me just identify the young girl eating the bowl of cornflakes, not getting really enough calories, and feeling depressed. So just to put her aside for a second, and going back to what you were saying earlier, is sometimes how you see yourself or what you believe about yourself is not necessarily consistent with one's behaviors. I think what happens there is there could be a cognitive dissonance because people have principles. And it's important to identify, like, what are your own individual morals and ethics and principles? And because we rely and resort to those to guide us when we're going through difficult situations. And I think that it's important to really know at the core, what are those for me? Not necessarily ones I've been told by society or by my religion or by my spirituality. It could be a conglomerate of all of those things. But when it comes down to what do you truly believe, what is your personal philosophy? Because that will help guide you in life and making some difficult decisions. And we all are confronted with difficult decisions in our lives. And when we feel regret, it's because something is maybe out of alignment between how we want to see ourselves and our actions that are maybe not measuring up. And I had a recent client actually who was really confronted with a big dilemma in that he saw himself as a coward and he wanted to see himself as courageous. And when he was measuring himself with his principles and philosophy and ethics, he felt deep regret and guilt for his recent behaviors and how he handled a conflict. And so he looked back on his life and said, I've done this before. This is what I resort to. And I'm a coward at the end of the day. And I want to be brave. And so we talked about, well, what would that mean? How would you have acted differently in this situation? How do you want to see yourself after handling that situation differently? And let's correct it. Let's go back to that same person and address the issue to find that resolution. And things may get worse before they get better. Are you prepared for that? And ultimately, how do you want to feel about yourself? It may be hurtful. You may still feel bad about yourself, but at the end of the day, you know you did what was right despite it being hard. And sometimes taking the easier way out, we don't necessarily feel better about ourselves. Mm-hmm. We feel worse. And so cognitive dissonance is a form of cognitive therapy that results in unease and tension inside of us because what we're doing is not in alignment with how we choose to see ourselves. It's a healthy thing. We want that to be there.
Yeah, I find often that the way I'm acting doesn't line up with how I see myself. Mm-hmm. So as an example, I clearly, my sense of meaning is I want to try to help people find agency. And I really believe in our country that people have lost a sense of who they are mm-hmm. and the importance of individualism. And that comes from a loss of agency. And that if you can help people restore that, mm-hmm. it ends up making a huge impact on them. Now, I know a big part of that is having a sense of optimism and being grateful and being thankful. But sometimes my desire to make change overpowers my ability to be optimistic mm-hmm. and to be thankful, mm-hmm. right? I start to work too much. I start to
crack the whip on other people around
Crack the whip on other people around me. Sorry.
Apology accepted.
But it's this drive of always wanting to do more.
Yeah.
And I know that part of it, I've spent a lot of time thinking about, like, where does that come from? Where does this sense of I'm running out of time, I'm not going to be able to get done the things that I want to get done in life, where that ambition makes me stressed, even though it's headed in the direction that I want it to head into, but it's overpowering my ability to be optimistic and to be thankful and to be the person that I want to be to my children and my grandchildren and the people that I love.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
That's a tough one. I just had a vision of this man. He was a spiritual leader in our community, and when my Aunt Tracy was dying of cancer, she was laying on her bed, and she was at peace. And he came to her, and I was laying I was at her bedside with her, and he came to her and said, "Tracy, do you feel like you accomplished what you needed to accomplish in your life?" And she took a moment and she paused and she reflected and she said, "Yes." And he said, what is the main thing that you feel was the most important contribution that you've made?" She said, without even a moment pause, "My children." And it was such a beautiful thing. And I think it's important to really reflect on that. And it goes back to meaning and purpose. What do we feel what are we accomplishing in our life? Do we feel fulfilled with what we're accomplishing? And if not, well, that's an opportunity, because we don't know if tomorrow's for certain. None of us do. Anything could happen at any time. And if we're not satisfied, if we're not feeling like we're on the right path, even though we might be enduring extreme adversity and hardship, it's important to make that change.
Yeah, we've interviewed lots of people who have been through very, very harsh conditions. People who, we interviewed people who were in Bosnia and that were slated for ethnic cleansing. We interviewed people that were in Iraq that suffered the terror and the horrors of Saddam Hussein and his torture chambers. We interviewed people in Rwanda listening to what happened between the Tutsis and the Hutus. And I think the ones that always interested me were the people who had depression. And one individual who I don't want to mention their name, but I asked them, what are you say that you're depressed. Is it from all the stress of what happened in your life? And they said, no, what I'm stressed about is I feel like my life hasn't had any meaning. Right. And it was fascinating to me to recognize that in all that they had experienced, they didn't find meaning, right? But yet, they'd done incredible things. They had helped out people survive inside of the camps. They had helped people who were slated for extinction. They'd raised families. They'd raised their children, and I think what I thought about when I heard their story was about how sometimes, for my own self, I don't recognize, hey, I am making a difference. Maybe not going as fast as I would like it to. Maybe I'm not getting in as much as I would like it to. But sometimes I have to stop and actually question myself. Hey, are the thoughts that I'm having, the labels that I'm putting on what's taking place in my life, are they accurate?
Yeah, and I think in this sense, self-agency is tied to identity. Who am I? That ultimate question. And if that person who has accomplished so much is doubting who they are and what they've contributed and maybe feeling like it's not enough and there's so much more I should have done, or what I did not measure up to what was really required, however they're painting that picture is possibly distorted. But ultimately, what is the shame that's preventing them from really recognizing what they've given and what they've contributed?
Yeah, I remember when I was a little boy, I was, maybe 8 or 9 years old. And I remember we lived in kind of a poorer neighborhood, and we had some neighbors not far from us that lived on the other side of the canal that were actually big, nice irrigated lots. I mean, we thought they were rich. I don't know that we would see them as being rich today, but I certainly, as a little boy, thought that they were. And I remember one time their mom coming out and watching their children play with me, and they said, "Get away from those kids. They have head lice." Right? Now, as far as I know, I never had head lice in my life, but I remember the feeling of not being good enough, not being worthy, and
you're inferior.
And it definitely gave me, it actually served a purpose. It gave me an incredible drive to want to do better, to want to help other people. And it gave me an empathy for people who oftentimes come from those types of environments. But the clash of those two things becomes, I never feel like I'm doing enough.
Yeah.
Right.
And to prove that they're wrong.
And to
Their
prove that they're wrong.
assumption of you is incorrect.
And their assumption of other people who were like me.
Yeah.
Right. And so it just becomes this constant drive. But in the meantime, you know, gosh, we have, you know, a 2-year-old little girl today that you took swimming, right? Just a wonderful experience. And sometimes it's hard to just take that laptop where I'm writing and typing and putting together either shows or writing editorials or the new book that I'm working on, all those other things.
Saving the world.
and just setting that aside going, wait a minute.
Yeah.
All the meaning I need in my life's right there.
Oh, I so agree.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. By the way, I watched you this morning. You did a wonderful thing. I watched you with Adina, who woke up and did not want to go to her swimming lesson.
Yeah.
Right? Now, it's kind of funny because I hate tyrants. I hate them, right? I like Saddam Hussein, Vladimir Putin, Mao, others. To me, this whole authoritarian mindset, and that can also include people in our own country, the alt-right or the woke left, the political authoritarian, the politically correct authoritarians, they anger me to think that they try to dominate over other people. But I oftentimes realize when it comes to my kids and my grandkids and my family members, I'm a tyrant, right? My answer would have been,
the train is leaving the station, either on aboard now or you were left
We're going
behind.
to a swim lesson, right? I was amazed. You said, well, okay. And you gave her choices.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit and talk about what you were thinking when you did that.
So in psychology, we have a term, roll with the resistance. So you never want to be on the other side battling up against it because now you're in a power struggle. And so the one way to get out of a power struggle is to go beside the person. And you could look at the problem from next to them, right? So that you're not being seen as a threat. And so I said to her, you know, I made it a little bit of a game and she was playing. And so I pulled out her bathing suit. She didn't want to put on her bathing suit. And I'm explaining, like, we're going to go to our swim lesson and see her friends and play on the playground there. And so she just kept saying, no, 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 no. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to put on her bathing suit. I said, okay, no problem. Mommy's going to go to the pool. And so I started putting on my bathing suit in front of her. I'm packing my bag. And so I put my bag on my shoulders and I said, okay, I'm going to go to the pool now. Bye-bye. You want to stay here or you want to come? So she immediately came out from behind the comforter and the pillows where she was hiding. And she said, no, I'm coming. I want to go to the pool.
By the way, in my experience, somewhere around 13, they figure you out.
Yeah. Like, this works for now at 2. And then I have to change my strategy. But, you know, one of the things was she was fighting with me as I was trying to put the bathing suit on earlier. And she's saying, no, I don't want to go swimming, no pool. And so she's fighting with me and I could see she was getting angry. And so I identified the emotion for her because this is really important, especially for a 2-year-old. They're learning to identify what's going on. And so I labeled the emotion for her. I said, okay, I can see that you're angry and you're fighting. You don't want to put your bathing suit on. You don't want to go to the pool. Okay. So then I took it off and I didn't continue fighting with her to put on the bathing suit. I just left it on the bed. I said, okay, I can see you're angry. And so then I let her calm down and I gave her a few things and I walked out of the room temporarily and just gave her some time to calm down. And she was able to regulate herself. I could hear her, you know, she was still upset and complaining a bit, but then she was able to self-soothe and I put some things on the bed for her to do that. And then I was able to come back in the room and then we carried on the conversation. So, I mean, all of this took about, it extended about 10 or 15 minutes.
Like I said, I'm a tyrant.
It was an important learning opportunity.
I thought that it was beautiful.
She's learning her emotions. She's learning to self-soothe. She's learning to emotionally regulate. She's learning to trust herself. She's learning to make decisions for herself. I'm giving her choices. And in the end, she chose to go swimming, and she chose to go to the pool. But there was so much learning that was packed into those 10 or 15 minutes. All right, I want to hit
a little thing that you said there, because I think as it relates to mastering your emotions and cognitive distortions, it's important. You labeled the emotion. Right? That's an interesting thought. So we spent a lot of time on different shows talking about the amygdala hijack, the idea that this more ancient part of your brain that is tens of millions of years old, which has a fight or flight instinct, fight, flight, freeze, or defend, oftentimes overpowers the neocortex, and it stops you from having the ability to rationalize, to be optimistic, to love, to think, right? And so we know that those emotional impacts can sometimes have an effect on you being able to be rational. Now, there's a little bit of a reversal to that. I have spent my entire life focused on being rational. Being rational in everything that I do and suppressing.
You trust it. You don't trust your emotions.
I don't trust my emotions.
You trust your thoughts.
And I think it's even more than not trusting. I don't even know when they're there.
Yes, you were that example that I was saying about the analytic.
Right.
The person who's highly rational, analytical, tend to feel more comfortable in the thought process. They do not feel comfortable in the emotions.
And I think there's a downside to that.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a downside to being on the other polarized end.
Right. So the downside to that is some of the most wonderful things that happen to us in life are in those emotional states. It's the ability to be able to manage them that becomes important, but that doesn't mean you ignore them. And I definitely think that like I said, I not only ignore them, I don't even know that they're there. This concept that you talked about a second ago, labeling them, identifying, I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm feeling sad, knowing that it exists. That doesn't mean that you dwell on it, but at least knowing that it's there so you identify it. Do you see that as being important in the people that you work with, and why?
Yeah. I mean, oh my gosh, I think one of the first emotions that our daughter has learned to label was fear. And she would come up to us and say, I'm scared, and want to be held, and taught that she's safe and feeling safe. So how do you deal with the addressing the emotions in therapy? Let me make sure I have your question right. So like for somebody who's more in the analytical mindset.
And I'm asking, do you see that as being a problem, that they can be so analytical that they completely dismiss all emotions?
Yes, it is a problem.
And second, when that is in fact the case, how do you deal with it? How do you help them manage it?
Yes. So you have to identify the emotion in order to help somebody manage it. You can't just bypass that process to get to just fixing the solution. No. The only way out is through. So we have to do the dirty work in order to get there. So even if you need time to process the emotion and you can't do it automatically in the moment, that's okay. Work with what you have. And you may be able to find the hot thoughts that are bothering you. And what you need to do is when you feel like you feel safe enough to explore the emotional part and access the emotional part, it may be sometime after the situation has erupted. That's okay, but you need to be able to do that work. And so this is where a psychologist or a therapist could be really helpful, because they can help you dissect and identify what those could be. So there are different ways. If somebody is so detached from their emotions, I may have to get them outside of themselves because it's too distressing or overcoming or overwhelming for them to do that on their own. So I'll say, well, for me, I imagine if I was you going through that situation, I might feel this, or this. And I could see for you, even as you're describing it, and I might point out things that I observe in their body. I could see your jaws clenching. I could see that your posture is really rigid. I could see your shoulders seem so tight. I feel the tension just sitting in front of you. So I might give them those observations, and that might help them to be able to see, yeah, you know what? I think I've been holding my breath this whole time. I don't even think that I've been getting enough oxygen in my body. So once you have some of those observations, that can be helpful then go to the next part, to the emotion. I know it's so theoretical; it can be really hard. It might be helpful with an example.
Yeah, I think I can help with an example. So, an example would be this: if you can't identify the fact that you're afraid, it becomes very hard to fix it, right? So if your answer is, look, I don't like feeling this way, or you see that your actions aren't working correctly, and you can't identify what the emotion is, sometimes it becomes challenging to fix it. So as an example, fear, right? Well, let's deal with fear in two ways. There are things that you can begin to see physiologically when somebody's afraid, right? Their shoulders will slump over, their breathing becomes a little more shallow, their eyes become a little more widened, right? Well, part of changing that, you can change that fear physiologically. If you know and identify that it's there's something that you're afraid of, actually putting your shoulders back, puffing up your chest, getting yourself some breaths, all those things begin to rationally help you think through what you're going to do. But it's also important to think about, wait a minute, I don't want to be afraid. I don't want to be known for being afraid. I want to be courageous. By the way, both of those concepts are invisible. You can't see them, right? They're an ideal. They're an ideal. I'm afraid. Why am I afraid? I'm courageous. Why am I courageous? But you can apply fear and courage to the exact same situation, and you can create that label inside your mind, meaning what you think has an effect on how you feel. How you feel is affected by your physiology, as well as your physiology being affected by your emotion.
Yeah, absolutely. And then acting with courage doesn't necessarily mean that you were absolved of fear. A lot of people still experience fear while they act with courage. I remember.
In fact, I don't think you can have courage without fear. If you think about it, you're not really courageous if there was no fear involved with it, if there was no risk involved with it.
Yeah, and I think the problem is if somebody is very self-analytical and they tend to be more on the anxious or depressive side, they tend to focus a lot on how people might see themselves, how people might see them, how what they're saying may sound stupid, or they may feel humiliated in certain social situations, and they'll have self-defeating thoughts and attitudes that prevent them from acting with courage. And these are people who tend to be very hyper-focused on themselves. If you put that same person in a situation where they're helping another person or they're having to be there to support another person, it takes them out of their own self-defeating thoughts because they're there to help another person. So there are ways to get out of that. There are different tricks and strategies that one can use.
Yeah, and it's, again, you mentioned that it's complex, but I do think that the labels that we use have an effect on how we think. So I had Brandon Tatum on our show the other day. Brandon is kind of a phenom in podcasting. He has millions of different viewers. He's an American of African descent. He was a Tucson police officer. And he has a very different point on race that most people who are of African descent, Americans of African descent, would have. Right? One of them is he rejects any sense of he's a victim. And he also rejects that racism is as widespread as oftentimes we allow the political narrative to be able to accept. Now, here's where I find this to be interesting. I liken it to the psychologist, right? The psychiatrist who can administer drugs. And the only drug they administer, again, this is hypothetical, there's no real person that I've put behind this, but the only drug they have is to issue as antidepressants. So for everyone they meet, they issue an antidepressant. Well, there are some people who that antidepressant is not going to work on. It's going to fail on, right? If you really are in a harsh environment and you really are dealing with stressful issues, the antidepressant's not going to help you. The environment really is having an effect on you. It really is. And either you need to change the environment or you need to change the way you're seeing that environment. But the antidepressant probably, in fact, there's lots of studies on this, they're ineffective. Well, I think that's what happens oftentimes with racism. I met real racist. Believe me, people who not only were racist, but that said they were racist, right? People whose view of the world was very much driven by race and the group that you were in, and the views that they had, in my opinion, were very dark. I've met thousands of police officers. I'm not saying that none of them were racist, but I never met one that I thought was, that was clear to me that they were. But we throw around that term so much, it's like issuing one diagnosis for every problem because it fits the narrative. And the challenge to that is you're going to miss really fixing a bunch of problems when you do that. You need to tease these things apart, and you need to look at them more objectively, and you need to kind of remove labels from it to have a better understanding. And most importantly, if your view is, if you're coming from a victim mindset, right, meaning if you see the world in terms of oppressed and oppressors, man, fixing this is really hard. My dad used to say, son, it's your fault. And it would upset me so much. And I'd say, Dad, it wasn't my fault. He'd go, if it wasn't your fault, you can't fix it. Take ownership of this thing. Take ownership of it, right? There's a role that we play in determining our own life. And I look at the spectrum and say, okay, it's really hard to figure out, like, which one's right. You talked about the behavioralist versus the cognitive psychologist, right? The two different types of thinking. I can't help but think they're both right. I can't help but think that your emotions do affect your physiology. Your physiology does affect your emotions.
It does.
Your thoughts affect your emotions. Your emotions affect
They're
your
all
thoughts. And
interrelated.
all of that affects your actions.
Yeah, just
right?
imagine arrows going both ways and all around in a circle.
And so when you begin to recognize that, you recognize, hey, there are multiple starting points. And sometimes
Which
it
is
depends upon the
accessible.
problem.
Yes. Yeah. There was a couple things you said that really hit home for me. First of all, I think Brandon Tatum, is that his name? I appreciate his perspective. I think it's an important perspective to be part of the discourse on racism. I also want to highlight, because we are a show on optimism, I love that we can talk about racism. You know, it used to be a taboo subject. And maybe in many places it still is, you know, just like talking about sexism or ageism. But we're now at a place, I think, where we have the strength, when we were talking about strength over safety, to be able to have these difficult conversations and bring, you know, diverse opinions to the table. By
the way,
share
that's risky.
Perspectives. It is very risky.
Right? There's no doubt. There's a risk to it. I guess I'm kind of lucky. I'm 63. Maybe I'm going to die soon, so it doesn't matter. But I'm being facetious. But the point that I'm trying to make...
You know what? You're going to live to be 120, knowing you.
But the point I'm giving to you is, it is a little easier to not be afraid as you get older and you feel like you're going to be okay regardless, right? And it's also
that's
okay.
An inherent confidence.
It's also okay when you go, look, I want to change the dialogue. And I can't change the dialogue without taking on risk. In fact, I found the single biggest inhibitor to real change was fear, right? Yeah. And whenever I identify people becoming afraid, like I'm afraid somebody's going to label me as a racist, I realize, oh my gosh, you've just created an inability to be able to really look at the problem fairly. And that's true with almost any label that you can apply to people. But as you're able to overcome that fear, and as you're able to look at it a little more objectively, you have to start with this. I have a bias. Of course I do. All of us have a bias. Yes. Everybody involved in the game has a bias. That's where we're going to get to talking about a cognitive distortion versus a cognitive bias. We all have cognitive biases. Sometimes those biases are good, sometimes they're bad. But it's a problem if you don't acknowledge that you have one too.
Yeah, like our bias, you and I, is that we tend to be more optimistic and less of a skeptic. And that is a bias.
It definitely is. And in fact, I would say it's an intentional one, right? It's a...
Sometimes I think that
it
also is inherently part of my approach to life.
But there are people that I've spoken to who fall into that victim mindset, who will have discussions with me, and I can't convince them, and they can't convince me. No. This is, their view of it is there is nothing they can do. They are helpless in that situation, and who knows, maybe they are. But for me, I know if that's the truth, there's no way to fix it.
There's something important I really want to say here, and you touched on it before. You said if somebody is in a traumatic situation, and sometimes trauma, there's no distinct start and distinct end point to trauma. For some people, if they, as children grow up in abusive households where there's a lot of domestic violence, or they grow up in communities where there's a lot of gang violence, and they're just surrounded by chaos and trauma on a day-to-day basis, and it's unpredictable, and they don't know when it's going to be amplified or when it's going to be like relative security and stability. That is really complex, compounded trauma. And then if other things happen to them, like if they were sexually abused or physically abused or things happening directly to them, there are other things that could be happening in their environment. As they get older, it shapes and distorts how they see the world, how they view relationships, even their attachment to people. They learn that people are not safe. They may then form ways to detach from emotions or numb emotions. They may be more at risk of abusing substances as a way of self-medicating to also help numb themselves. So what I'm trying to say is sometimes people will come into therapy and say, well, I'm paranoid and anxious. I'm like, okay, well, what's going on in your life? Tell me about it. Well, I'm in a violent relationship, and my partner's attacked me recently. We have a child, and I'm scared to leave. I'm scared to stay. I'm not quite sure what I should do. But help me with my paranoia. I don't want to feel anxious anymore. Like, well, actually, no, that's not the right approach. The anxiety and fear and the tension and paranoia you're experiencing is there for survival purposes, and it's there for a reason. We don't want to alter that. We want to get you out of a threatening environment, or look at creating a plan. How are we going to keep you safe and your child safe? And we're going to create a safety plan. So let's look at that together, because all of those emotions are there for a reason. And I'm not going to be here to teach you of how to tolerate being a victim and just endure that. That's or endangering your child and how to just endure that. That's not right.
Yeah, I think the opposite of being a victim is the recognition that you have choices, that there are alternatives, and that oftentimes those choices are broad and we ignore them. I love, again, the whole concept that sometimes the only choice left is how you view it. That is the only choice that you have left, and you are in an environment. You're in prison, and you can't get out.
Yeah.
Right. But I think it's important to look at those that you can't get out of, to recognize when you're the rest of us, there are a lot more choices.
Yes.
The only choice that you have if you're in Auschwitz or if you're in prison for a capital crime is to change how you see things and to change your life there. You're not going to change the environment. You don't have control over that. But when the rest of us look at that, we should be able to say, well, if they can look at things differently, not only can I look at things differently, but I can recognize that I have more than one option, that I have multiple options. And if I've decided to stay in a position where it's a problem, I'm just making a bad decision. I'm not a victim. I'm just making a bad decision.
Yeah. And so that's why it's really important. I don't want people to maybe misunderstand or misinterpret what we're saying, but there are different choices and different ways to analyze a situation. And we're not saying to tolerate being abused. We're not saying to tolerate an abusive situation. And
Quite the opposite.
Absolutely. And so there is like crisis stabilization plans, safety plans, risk assessment plans, threat assessment plans. I mean, there are all kinds of different ways that we can employ some different skills and tactics and strategies for being able to see what the options are, assess what the threat is, and be able to determine some choices that are going to get people to safety. Once they get to safety and security, that's when we can start reprogramming your thought process. But we don't want to do it before then. So usually when I meet with survivors of domestic violence, they tend to come in for therapy after they've left an abusive home environment and they're in a safer relationship, and that's when they are coming in for therapy, and they say, I don't know what's going wrong with me. I'm just a complete wreck. I can't do anything. I'm totally helpless. I can't get up in the morning. I can't get to work, and everything that I'm doing. It's like, well, I think that you did everything in survival mode, and now that you've reached safety, you've hit that breaking point, and now the body and emotions is catching up with you, but because you got yourself here. So now you're in a place that you're able to process and now reevaluate and reformulate what is going on and where you want to be and promote healing. And so when you see it from that perspective, now we're starting to already change some of those cognitive distortions just in the way we're assessing somebody's helplessness.
All right, so let's go into different types of cognitive distortions. If you would give me, I know there are a number of them, but give me a handful of them that I think that you see most often.
Yeah, I think it might be most helpful to give some of these through examples. So I had a client recently who was catastrophizing. So, predicting something worse is going to happen than, what may eventuate. And by doing so, acted upon the threat and made some decisions that actually turned out worse for her than it could have. So this is a working professional, and there was a complaint that was made about her treatment of a consumer, somebody who had come into this clinic, and so she right away was concerned because now HR was doing an investigation into this complaint to see what was going on. So they started interviewing some employees and some other coworkers. They did an interview of her, and she met with upper management, and she didn't really fight or defend herself. Ultimately, she did make a mistake. There was an error of judgment that she was willing to take responsibility for, but she anticipated that this was so much worse in the way that people were viewing her that it was so intolerable for her. She anticipated that she was going to be fired. She anticipated this was going to ruin her career. And so before the investigation was even complete, she quit. And she didn't ask for help. She didn't offer the truth and the facts and lay out the facts. She didn't ask questions about what her rights were. She didn't even offer up her version of the story. And so she quit, and then she hasn't been employable since. And I said, well, why did you do that? Why not, like, as difficult as it was to endure, being on that other end, and nobody likes it where you feel like you're being under a microscope and everything that you've done and said is being analyzed and maybe misinterpreted or skewed in a way that looks really badly for you. That was so intolerable for her, but she was catastrophizing how this was going to end up. And so her way of taking control was to just end it. And I'm out. That's it. It's over. I'm not even going to fight or endure this any longer. And so there were so many missed opportunities that she could have engaged her rights. She could have asked if there was video footage to help prove that what she was being accused of didn't in fact happen. She didn't consult with an attorney to see what she can do to defend herself and maintain employment and accept accountability for a mistake, an error in judgment that she did do. So there were so many different options and iterations of things that could have happened from the point that that complaint was put in to that final determination. And so I see this all the time, and this is where people self-sabotage as a result of their cognitive distortions.
A couple that I find to be interesting, especially in our work that we've done on extremists, terrorists, and genocides. One of them that's really fascinating to me is the heaven fallacy, right? The heaven fallacy is this belief that says, hey, if I do good things, God rewards me. God gives me better things. Well, the downside to that is that must mean if bad things are happening to you, that God is punishing you. And, we interviewed a lot of people, and I saw that. I saw that there were some people who believed that maybe these bad things that had happened to people, they must have deserved, that God would have done that to them, right? And I think it's important to recognize that God doesn't interfere in every single instance. That He gave us an incredible power of choice, and in that incredible power of choice, sometimes there are bad people who make really bad decisions that harm the rest of us. Just happens. It's one of the things that comes with choice. Now, at the same time, we have the free will to be able to see that how we want, but it is a cognitive distortion to believe, hey, Jews lost their lives in Auschwitz because they must have done something wrong.
Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of beliefs and distortions that are there that can have significant impacts. One of the other beliefs or cognitive distortions to add is emotional reasoning. And I was thinking through this example the other day. I thought, because it's such a common one. So if I'm feeling insecure, anxious in my relationship, and having thoughts that might be below the surface, sometimes the thoughts are subconscious, and those are even harder to access. But there's ways to be able to get at it if you can analyze it, and there are steps to be able to self-analyze it. But if I think ultimately, even subconsciously, if I'm not desirable and attractive enough for my man and my partner, he's going to be tempted by other women. And I want to ensure that he is satisfied with me so that he doesn't leave me. And if that is a running thought that is going on in my mind, if
the opposite must be true as well, then.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
If they're not staying faithful, it must be you.
Yeah, that can be a way that you're interpreting a situation, and that is run by some assumptions. So ultimately, it is my fault, and it is my responsibility in there as a partner. But it is also driven by the feelings of anxiety and insecurity. So if I'm not feeling as desirable, or if I'm believing that I'm less desirable, or if I'm believing that I'm less attractive, or that my partner doesn't find me as attractive, or they're more seduced by something else, at other people that they're with, or women that they're surrounded by, or people that they are even seeing, then that can also influence my insecurity and in turn in my self-doubt. So all of those things can then impact my sense of confidence in my relationship, and the intimacy and the trust. And so I may do things based on some of my emotional reasoning. So that is a cognitive distortion. It's emotional reasoning. I feel insecure, therefore, my husband, doesn't desire me as much, and he must be tempted by other women. It's driven by the feeling that is not rooted in reality. And if I believe that to be true, I may sabotage my relationship because of how I act. I might be accusatory towards him. I might say, I saw you looking at that woman, or you're spending more time with this attractive employee. Are you desiring to be with that person? Are you not attracted to me as much? And so my behaviors might amplify the situation. And so here's the other risk. It's called a self-fulfilling prophecy. I may push somebody to behave and act in a way that I'm assuming out of them, so I can prove to myself that I was right all along. And I'm discounting, this is another cognitive distortion, all of the things that go against it. So discounting the positives. Well, you make a point of spending every single night with me. You are available for me every day from 5 p.m. onwards. And it's really up to me whether or not I can make it to dinner on time. And you will always be there for me. Our weekends are exclusively our family time. These are things that you've carved out of your life to be with me for. And if I'm not seeing that and I'm just seeing all the other things, well, you went to lunch with this attractive person, or you're, spending more time with this other attractive person. I'm
becoming
just
personal. All of a sudden.
Yeah, it's tangible. I could address it, and I'm human and a woman. So, and it's a common theme and a common story in so many relationships. So, so I think it's helpful. But yeah, I think that there's so many things to that example that can show, like, where emotional reasoning, discounting the positives, you're magnifying the problem and minimizing things that would discount the evidence and facts of what is to be true. And then it's driven by this self-fulfilling prophecy, because I want to prove that it's true so I could say, aha, I knew I was right all along. So this is
one more before we do what can help, or what you can use, tools that you can use to help it.
Okay.
Anyone who's been online knows that when a political debate happens online, that there is this cognitive distortion by the individuals who are arguing of the need to be right. And it may be more of a need than a distortion, but that whole I'm right thing becomes kind of a blind spot. Now, I do think the last place you should argue about politics is online, because you can't say things there that would help in the discussion. Like, well, tell me why you feel that way. Give me a better understanding of where you're coming from. All right, I need to know why it is that you think that way. And in a political debate, if you're going to have a meaningful political debate, as opposed to one where you gain that rush of dopamine when you say, I won that fight. If the goal of the debate is, hey, I want to learn something and I hope to teach you something. But of course, if your thought is, I only want to teach you something, and all I'm really going to do is I'm going to ask questions that are really self-serving in my process. Well, if you're not willing to learn, it's doubtful they're going to be willing to learn. So a real discussion allows the ability for both people to be able to present their biases and their points of view, and to gain a better understanding of where they're coming from. So you can have a better ability to understand that in the future. And online is the worst place to be able to do that. But you can watch this bias with people who need to be right, and they'll go back and forth. And then it's inevitable that it degrades, right? They start with creating a political argument that needs to be right. And then before they're done, they're insulting the other person, talking about, where did you get your news, or talking about, how ridiculous a position that is, or saying insulting things to one another. But it is that need to be right, I think, is a distortion as well. Or do you see that as more of a need?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's that, we were talking about self-righteousness before. I think inherently what is underneath or driving that need to be right, or that self-righteousness, is a defense against possibly being viewed as incompetent or unintelligent. And I think there's a defense mechanism that is probably being amplified. And it's like that narcissist who wants to be adored by every single person, but really, and they appear very confident. And they're people like them, they gravitate towards them, but underneath it all, there is this shallowness and this deep sense of insecurity and self-doubt. And so their way to defend against it is that they need to be surrounded by people who desire them and want them, and praise them and admire them. They love that. And so I think the same might be true in that situation. If somebody's really driven by that self-righteousness, and they're not allowing themselves to learn, they don't have that openness to have a shared mutual understanding and a dialogue, that they're really there to just dominate over another person, to show that, I'm superior.
And, I think that self-doubt, I mean, that is clearly people who are driven more towards ideological ends. There are a variety of different reasons for it. One of them is that there is a real release of adrenaline and dopamine inside the mind when you win an argument. And the opposite is true. You can feel like you got beat up when you lose one. Well, an ideology gives people answers to be able to debate better, to be able to have a discussion. It's a substitute for intellect, right? Intellect, in true intellect, you're learning, you're thinking, you're trying to understand, you're listening, you're exchanging ideas. Intellect isn't the ability to overpower someone with an argument. That's not intellect. That is a superficial need that maybe all of us have to some degree, to want to feel like we're right. Now, the only antidote to that is love that's releasing a whole different set of chemicals that make us feel good about ourselves. But let's go to the solution for a moment. We'll talk a little bit about the hierarchy in a moment. Let's talk about cognitive-based therapy and how that works and how people can self-administer that to some degree. I mean, it may be at times better to have a psychologist, but I think the concept of how that works is really interesting. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, and I think ultimately, and this is tied to what we were just talking about, ultimately what we want to do is build mental fortitude. And we have to be honest with ourselves to see what are my weaknesses, what are my vulnerabilities, what am I ashamed of other people finding out about me, what am I hiding and concealing from myself, let alone other people, because that's where the work is. And if you're not willing to do that part, then, I mean, the rest is just kind of patchwork. It's not really going to be as helpful. They're going to be very simple coping skills, but I think they're not going to be inherently therapeutic or effective long-term if you're not willing to do that deeper dive into what's going on inherently. We all have compensatory strategies, right? Like, I want to defend against people thinking or seeing my insecurity or my self-doubt or my fear of being viewed as incompetent. I'm going to cover that up with these compensatory strategies. Maybe I'm going to, lead with being called Dr. Bashah, lead with my doctorate, and that's going to serve as a barrier so that people can't actually see me, Emily, the human, the fallible, the one who, has regret. Yeah. Or things that I'm inadequate in or that I've failed in. And all of those things are true. So, but we have to know that about ourselves in order to take those layers, shed those layers, and really see the naked self.
All right. So I end up being highly depressed in a belief and believing that what I've just done is going to result in absolute disaster. All right, that everything's going to fall apart in my life because of an action that I just took. That would be what type of cognitive distortion?
Catastrophizing.
All right.
And some of them are very linked. So you're probably like over magnifying the problem. You're probably minimizing or discounting other things that are going well in your life and are going to support you and help you get through no matter what happens.
So with a therapist, you might start by trying to understand that. And then, but if you were going to do that without a therapist, you might start with just writing it down.
Yeah.
Writing down how do you feel and what were the things that you said about yourself in that process.
Yeah, and look for the evidence. What is the evidence for that supports this belief, and what is the evidence against this belief? So
you start by identifying it, and then you move to trying to figure out what might be true and what might not be true. I know another way that folks have talked about doing that is ask yourself, what would my friend tell me? Or what would a therapist tell me? Is this true?
Yeah, exactly. Or how would I think about another person that was going through the same situation? What might I think about them or say to them? So once you've identified the thought and identified the emotion, also identify the behavior, the physiology, and then the sensations that you're experiencing in your body.
Talk about those two, the physiology and the sensations. What would those be?
Physiology might be your heart racing, might be an accelerated breath. You might have some like shallow breathing. Sweaty palms, that's all physiology. Body sensations is, you might notice like a closing of your throat, or maybe there's like heat in your chest, or you may feel like you want to go into the fetal position and hide it in a cocoon. So you find yourself like making your body very small, rather than seeing yourself as like bigger and bolder and confident. So write all of those things down so you really get a full perspective of where things are at. And this is just a snapshot in a moment. And then you look for the evidence for and against the beliefs that you're having. And then you want to go to a reformulated, restructured thought. How can I think about and reframe what I'm telling myself that helps to weigh in that balance so that I'm not catastrophizing, I'm not magnifying the problem and minimizing the things that are counter to what I'm fearing is going to be true. And now you've got to reframe, and it's going to be a more balanced thought.
Mm-hmm. What I like about this is two things. I can see where a therapist could be very helpful because they're walking you through it and they're trained in it, but they're still getting you to this end where you've told the story and you've thought about the emotions and about what was happening and what you were thinking about yourself. You've thought about how other people may see it, and then by itself, it's going to start to reformulate in your mind what happened here. And maybe I did overblow this. Maybe it's not as bad as I thought. I think the goal is to get to where you don't have to do it on paper and where you don't have to do it with a psychologist, but where you can do it automatically.
Yes.
Where you can just start to begin to think this through, saying, hey, I need to give myself a neutralizer.
Yes.
I need to feel better about what it is that's happening right now.
Yeah.
How might other people see this, right? And so you start to create that balance for yourself.
Yeah, I'm smiling and kind of laughing on the inside here.
When I try to do psychology.
No. I was thinking about a situation. Actually, you're doing pretty well. Like I have to tweak you every now and then, but you're doing very well. I was thinking I have like a go-to consultant whenever I hit that panic button in myself, if I'm in a really difficult, high-profile forensic case or something has come up in my forensic work and I'm like, okay, like this could go really bad very fast. I need to, call someone I trust. And so this is a retained attorney who I get to talk to freely and openly with client attorney privilege. So whenever that panic button hits for me, and for sure I'm in that, magnification of the problem because I've gone down that rabbit hole and I tend to go to death, like people are going to die in this situation. This is going to turn out very badly. I'm going to lose my license and that kind of thinking. And so when I call him right away, it just gives me this sense of assurance, like, I've got another person that believes in me and is going to be there at the end to defend me if I ever need to. And so just talking through, identifying the facts, he forces me to slow my thought process down. He helps me be able to analyze the situation. Then he has to repeat back to me what he's hearing of the story. So all of that slows the process down. It helps to discern the facts. And by the time I'm done with that call, I feel so much more confident and calmer and self-assured. I've got a strategy. I've got a plan. These are my next steps. Even though it's unpredictable exactly how another person's going to respond to me or how a situation may play out, I now at least feel like, okay, I've got the support that I needed, and I'm definitely in a better place to think through more rationally rather than emotionally when I've called him. So if you have that go-to person, I mean that's just one example. It doesn't have to be a licensed psychologist. It can be a friend, but somebody who's going to help you not just amplify the emotion. That is not the right friend that you want to talk to.
And those friends exist, people who will empathize with you, telling you how bad it was,
and help you
and
cycle
take you down the rabbit
further.
hole, right?
Yeah, be aware of those people because they may think that they're helping you in the moment, but really, if you notice that you're just accelerating and intensifying an emotion, you probably need to, go to somebody who's going to be more rational.
And it's it's funny because I see in my family, I definitely tried to help people think through the other side. And sometimes it's the other person's position. I have other family members who are very empathetic and identify with people and the problems that they're going through. And you can watch them go to different people at different times because sometimes they just need somebody to empathize with them.
Yeah.
But if you want to fix a problem, you have to be able to think in a broader way. What I love about cognitive-based therapy, CBT, is that the correct name?
Cognitive behavioral therapy.
There we go, cognitive
CBT.
behavioral therapy. What I love about it is that it was an evolution, right? It was an evolution from saying, gosh, all these problems are psychological disorders or they are they're areas where we need to medicate. We need to try to get you out of your depressed state. And instead, it's about trying to figure out how to help you change your thinking and to move in another direction. Now, we've hit on our website, we have on optamerican.com, we have the hierarchy of agency, and we're going to have a worksheet on this. It'll be called Mastering Your Emotions, Cognitive Distortions, and CBT. But we've hit almost everything in that hierarchy when you think about it. We certainly talked about meaning, the importance of meaning. We talked about how love plays into this. We talked about the role that physiology plays into it, that you need to be accountable to yourself and think about what's your diet and what are you eating and what's your workout look like, because physiology affects your thought and thought affects your emotions and emotions affect your actions. That all four of those things are interconnected. And as you said, the arrows are going in every direction. But in hitting on all of them, the single most important one is the very first one. Know the truth.
Yes.
And that's really what cognitive distortions are. They're an untruth. They're a magnification. They're taking something that has some shred of truth to it and making it a bigger deal. Now, I believe political parties and politicians and the news media and social media do that on purpose. They intentionally want to try to create a distortion cognitively for you. But we can do it for ourselves pretty easily if we want to. And understanding how to get to the truth is really an important part. And that brings us back to what's this all about? Finding agency. Being able to restore your sense of self-agency so you control yourself.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, and I think, I guess going back to one of the examples, sometimes it can be harder to do that deeper work that is going to be the right path, because ultimately we just want to get to that simpler solution. And so we might trick our thinking or fool ourselves into believing that that's the right thing because we know that it's going to be easier and I'm not going to have to confront this difficult situation that could potentially end more badly for me. Let me just avoid the responsibility and just do the simpler thing. But that doesn't always play out well for us because of the cognitive dissonance that I talked about before. And so when that happens, we have to listen to that because it's telling us something underlying that we're deceiving ourselves. And self-deception and self-betrayal are clues for where we need to make a change and have that opportunity to have a deeper look and gain the insight into ourselves.
All right. Well, Dr. Bashah, thanks again.
Yeah.
I appreciate
Paul.
you being on the show. You're with the Optimistic American. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American show. Now help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.